want to start off by just giving a little bit of background about who I am. And then I want to talk today about the topic before us, spiritual bypass. And spiritual bypass for me is part professional, part personal. So I think there's a saying, you know, all research in psychology is me search. So some of the information I'll share is, you know, spiritual, theological, but also psychological. And I do a lot of work in the area of research, which I'll share with you here. But I want to start off just telling a little bit about myself. So I am the chair of the Department of Counselor Education. Excuse me, I was just talking about pastoral counseling. Chair of the Department of Counselor Education at Stetson University in DeLand, just a couple hours from here. And I've been there for about 6 years. Before that, I was in a Department of Pastoral Counseling at Loyola University in Baltimore, Maryland. And prior to that, I was a pastor's kid and a missionary kid. And so my earliest memories were growing up in a Native American village in Mexico, actually. And are there any other pastors' kids? Okay, a few. Okay, awesome. You know, one of the great things about growing up in ministry is you are reminded of some really ultimate concerns about life frequently. Because I grew up going to a lot of funerals that were not my family. And so from a very early age, a lot of big, weighty topics were just a part of my kind of daily, weekly, yearly life experience because that was what our family did, right? What that did is it exposed me from a very early age to what Paul Tillich calls the ultimate concerns about life. And these are finitude, that we're aware that one day we will die, meaning we question whether or not all of this difficulties, tragedies we go through is just chaos, or is there any meaning in it? And then thirdly, worthiness, you know, that when I look at the grand scheme of the world and my life in it, am I contributing to it in any sense of value? Am I giving to my community, or am I taking away from my community? So Paul Tillich called those the ultimate concerns. And life in, you know, pastoral ministry, you see all three of those very, very frequently, very, very early on. And so what it did is people always said, you have an old soul. And there was truth to that. I grew up very early being very serious about life, right? Because eternity did depend on it. And what we will talk about today is the tension between those is where spiritual bypass happens. And so before I get started, let me make my confession. I have engaged in spiritual bypass. Okay. I want to be very clear about that because spiritual bypass is not something that is actually infrequent or strange. I actually think it's kind of part of spiritual life. It's a part of growing up, in other words. So spirituality, spiritual bypass, it's normal, is what I walk away with. I do want to make mention about this project before I dive into that topic, because this is something that I think relates to the Samaritan counseling centers. This is the Spiritual Religious Competencies Project. And this was a $5 million grant we received from the John Templeton Foundation, a foundation that's devoted to science and the big questions of life, like infinitude, meaning, and worthiness. The folks here in this room, I think, are more the exception but most people who go through training in mental health, whether or not that's clinical mental health, psychology, social work, are actually not trained to talk about spirituality and religiosity and related topics with their clients. In some cases, they're actively discouraged from it, that this is a taboo topic, and you don't talk about this with your clients. If it comes up, quickly refer them out, right? We've recognized now, and when I say we, I mean American Psychological Association, American Counseling Association, National Association for Social Work, has recognized that we cannot do business like that. That actually we could be engaging in a form of malpractice if we do not allow clients to talk about these topics with us. And there's very good reason for that, which I'll share with you in a minute, about some of the information we now know about how spirituality, religion, and health all interact with each other. So, spiritual bypassing. How many people have heard that before this presentation, that phrase, spiritual bypass, spiritual bypassing? Okay, so very few of us. I can guarantee you've probably seen it in some way, shape, or form, either in your work as a counselor or in your life of involvement with a faith community. John Welwood was the individual who coined that term, spiritual bypass, and he coined that in 1984. So the term has been around for almost 40 years, but it's actually not, to me, a new concept. And I've done some work to kind of actually map out where this concept, more or less, I think, originates from. Okay, but John Welwood put it this way: a spiritual bypass or spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. It's also important to mention that this is not one particular religion that does this. This is not one particular theology or one particular religious practice. It is much more about how one appropriates one's religion or one's theology or religious practice. The reason why I say that is because this is probably more often talked about in the context of Christianity, particularly like when you look at popular usages of this term. So if you do a quick Google search for spiritual bypass, spiritual bypassing, there's been a lot of blog posts in recent years that have, a lot of them are therapists who are now putting this out there into like the public space, and they'll talk about spiritual bypassing. But it's not really one particular religion. John Welwood, when he discovered this process, it was in the context of his Buddhist practice. And John Welwood was a psychotherapist, and he was also a Dharma teacher. And so if you're not familiar with Buddhism, a Dharma teacher is much like a pastor in Christianity. And so he noticed that people who were trying to live a Buddhist life, Buddhist practice, would, instead of dealing with really important psychological problems that were going on, whether or not that was their depression, their anxiety, their addictions, rather than talking through those things, they would want to move into their meditation practice. And what he noticed was that they didn't really grow either in terms of their meditation practice and their mindfulness, or psychologically. They remained stagnant, and they didn't quite mature. And so he called that spiritually bypassing. Why is it called that? Because what he noticed was that people were bypassing those difficult things and trying to get to that space in meditation where someone feels peaceful feelings. They feel blissful feelings. But for him, what he noticed was that it was really an island of calm in the midst of chaos in the individual's life. Okay, so that's really, really on the ground. That was from his first kind of person experience of noticing this. And he also, just like I did, he noticed he had this tendency to do that as well. Why? Because when you sit in silence, you meditate, sometimes you do discover things that are very difficult. And they're difficult about your life, your upbringing, your past. And in mindfulness terms, they're now being called mindfulness casualties. So for instance, people who have had traumatic experiences, when they adopt just an open field awareness practice, sometimes what that does is it brings in a rush in of traumatic memories that they can't handle, that they haven't processed, much like our talk earlier today, that this overwhelms their sensory experience, right? So those are actually called mindfulness casualties now. But that's what John Welwood was talking about. That psychological trauma, people couldn't work with it, through it, but wanted to do the spiritual all good feeling stuff to make it go away as much as possible, right? Okay, so that was in the 80s. Since then, the term has kind of popped up here and there, most frequently in the addiction world. And so if you're familiar with the 12 steps, when people go through step 4, it's a particularly rocky period of the recovery process. And what's going on in step 4? You take a searching, fearless moral inventory. You look at your life and you say, how has my addiction sabotaged my life, my relationships, very difficult things. And so what folks in the addiction world noticed was that people early in recovery, if they caught the fire of the spiritual experience really early on, they would want to skip over steps 4 and 5 to step 12. Okay. And what's step 12? I get to focus on giving what I've received back to other people. So altruism can be a really helpful thing, especially for like depression. And at the same time, altruism can be a way that people remove focus off themselves and say, well, let me focus on helping you, but I'm hurting. So this is like, sometimes people engage in what's like compulsive goodness. I'll serve and serve and serve other people, but internally my life is in chaos. But the service keeps me from needing to focus on that inner life of chaos that I know is there. And I can manage it by not focusing on me, but focusing on you. And so in training counselors, we all go through this to some way, shape, or another, that when we work with another person, we know eventually it's going to be like looking in the mirror. That the problems that they're trying to work through, the tragedies that they face have also been our tragedies. And so even in helping, it'd be very alluring, right? To say, I'm going to focus on you, client. I don't need to focus on me. So, counselors can do this too, right? So that was, how the term kind of started to manifest in the counseling world. And a few years ago, a colleague of mine, Craig Cashwell, and I started to say, well, we need to start looking at this more closely because we see this a lot. We hear about it a lot. But we don't really understand it that well, like what's really going on there. So that really piqued our interest about 5 years ago, and we started doing some research on it. And so I'll share a little bit about what we've been finding. Like I said, I don't think this is anything new, though. This is where my side of my personality is more philosophically driven. I was a philosophy major before I was a psychology major. I don't believe spiritual bypass is something that John Welwood just discovered in 1984. Okay. I think people have actually been talking about this since what we call the Enlightenment period, at least in these terms. The person you see in front of you, Auguste Comte, he's sometimes known as the father of the Enlightenment. And what he believed was that human beings across the ages have gone through 3 developmental stages. He believed humans initially believed in gods, as a way of protecting themselves from the harshness of life. That life was easier to get through if we believed in a all-powerful creator that would then rescue us from life's problems. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Okay. This was enormously influential in Western psychological theory. Because what he posited was that eventually science would explain things and we would no longer need God explanations for things. That basic idea really took root in Western psychotherapy. Karl Marx picked it up, but Karl Marx was not the primary person who influenced counseling and psychotherapy in this regard. It was really Freud. So if you will recall, Sigmund Freud believed religion was an infantilism. It was the thing that people regressed back into when they were experiencing anxiety, neuroses. That in order for them to be able to continue to survive, they go back to a childlike state and rely on an all-powerful father figure, right? Freud he wasn't the originator of that idea. He really just applied what was already going on to this field of talk therapy. He was enormously influential on behaviorism for that reason. Albert Ellis said more or less the same thing. Skinner, B.F. Skinner. More contemporary, Yalom is still alive, Irvin Yalom. His group psychotherapy textbook is still the best-selling group psychotherapy textbook. But he believes, much like Freud, that this is an irrationality. That he's unique because he will say, now belief in an all-loving God can work for people. I still think it's irrational, but it works for people. So he can appreciate devotion. He can appreciate sincere devotion. But this has been enormously influential in training people. And I think this is one of the reasons why this is a taboo topic still today in mental health. I actually think these folks were probably more or less talking about spiritual bypass, not really calling it that, but really throwing out the spiritual baby with the bathwater. So I don't think this is anything new. This is a great quote from the book, The Spirituality of Imperfection. Mental health and spirituality only know each other by caricature. And a caricature is a cartoon version of a reality. I think that's more or less still the case in a lot of circles, both in the spiritual end of the spectrum as well as the psychological end of the spectrum. Not everybody who is an atheist is a Freudian atheist, in other words. And not everybody who's religious is also religiously fundamentalistic either, right? Okay. But this has been enormously influential in shaping the way we actually talk about spirituality, I think. That spirituality is a way, depending upon your view, of rescuing, from solving the problem. There have always, too, been voices in this conversation that have not put it into those terms. I think they were more the minority, and that's probably why less people are aware of them. But this was from same time and era, William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience. He did not view religion as simply an avoidance strategy. He saw it much more in terms of functionality. Is it working for the person? That was very influential on Carl Jung, a disciple of Sigmund Freud, split with Freud partly on this particular issue. Gordon Allport, the personality psychologist, who's been very influential on the development of our current personality theory of the five-factor model of personality, which is the most popular personality theory now. They had a much different view of religious experience. They didn't see it as a way people simply avoid reality or avoid difficult things. They saw it as actually very pragmatic, very useful, and functional. It helps people in different ways. This is a great quote from one of those figures, Carl Jung. He said, no matter what the world thinks of religious experience, the one who has it possesses the great treasure of a thing that's provided him with a source of life, meaning, and beauty, and that has given a new splendor to the world and to mankind. Is there, as a matter of fact, any better truth about ultimate things than the one that helps you live, right? So if you think back to where I started, those ultimate concerns, we're all trying to make sense of those things. Where does my life fit into the grander scheme of the infinite world we live in? Is it all chaos or is it meaning? And where is my worthiness? Where do I fit into all of this? Carl Jung saw, religion, religious experiences as profoundly effective at helping resolve those questions for people. But we've oftentimes lost actually focus on those foundational questions in psychotherapy, which I think is actually roaring back at us, which I'll share in a minute. Carl Rogers, one of my favorites, he grew up as a pastor's kid, much like me, and went and was actually going to be a pastor, was getting trained at Union Theological Seminary in New York. But then he stopped his training. And why did he stop his training? He decided that his theological training was not going to give him the practical strategies to actually help people. He saw it as too abstract, too otherworldly, and it wasn't going to translate into what we would call like pastoral care. And so what did he do? He literally walked across the street to Columbia University, and that's where he got his educational psychology degree. And then the rest is history, person-centered therapy, et cetera, right? So he said this a couple years before he died. He said, when I'm at my best, it seems that my inner spirit has reached out and touched the inner spirit of the other. Our relationship transcends itself and becomes a part of something larger. Profound growth and healing and energy are present. Rogers, he never developed a model of spiritually integrated counseling or psychotherapy, but he was very sensitive to when there are moments of transcendence in a relationship. And he called it deep empathy. This was this is actually his description of empathy in its highest form. So that foundational condition of helping, empathy. This was his highest description of what that is, right? So there have been, different voices too that have been contributing to this. And if you fast forward to today, a lot has happened in health-related research and medicine and how it deals with the topics that I've just mentioned. Psychological experience, religious experience, and spirituality, and then health. So, has anybody seen this before? This figure that you see in front of you? This is from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. So this is a federal agency that provides funding and research on substance abuse, mental health, etc. What you see in front of you is now the wellness model that has become very, very influential in not just SAMHSA, but in medicine. So if you walk into a hospital, it's very likely that you will encounter a wellness wheel like this that has, interlocking circles with different dimensions to it: financial, social, emotional, intellectual, occupational. And now what you will invariably see is a spiritual circle in there as well. That spiritual circle is the most recent addition to the wellness model. The wellness model, I don't know if you're familiar, started with the World Health Organization in the 1970s. And then over time, more and more circles were added to it. It started out as biopsycho wellness, and then it became biopsychosocial, and then it became biopsychosocial, now eventually spiritual wellness, right? Well, there's a good reason why that's happened. You'll see spiritual wellness as meaning and purpose. They're trying to be inclusive of everybody, right, regardless of religious perspective, tradition. But there's a good reason why that started to be included. We have now over 6,000 studies that have looked at the interconnections between religion, spirituality, and health. And this includes mental health, but it also includes physical health. It includes mortality risk, cancer, diabetes, all forms of health, really. And there's a consistent pattern that's shown up. And that consistent pattern is the more people report having a robust spiritual wellness, a robust religious practice, the less likely they are to experience what are called the diseases of despair. This includes an 80% reduction in the likelihood that they'll develop an addiction. It includes a 70% reduction in the likelihood that they will develop major depression. It includes 50 to 60% reduction in their likelihood to engage in risky behaviors, like unprotected sex. Again, another 50% reduction in their likelihood to experience suicidality. Okay, so those are very powerful statistics that we now have at our hand. And when you think of them, they're really the flip side of when you think of finitude, chaos, lack of worthiness in your life. That's why they're called the diseases of despair, because they're really two sides of the same coin, in other words. The more we tend to have a robust spiritual life, the less likely it is that we'll develop these other complications and problems. Not in every case, though. There are still times and in situations where there is a negative relationship, okay? And I think what people are discovering is that something they didn't account for in a lot of these studies is religious crisis and religious struggles. What was now called spiritual and religious struggles. We now have over 30 longitudinal studies that have looked at spiritual religious struggles and psychological well-being. And what those studies have found is that spiritual and religious struggles are profoundly effective at creating distress. So it's for one thing, right? If I think you're mad at me, but if I think the God who created all of this is mad at me, that's on an even more detrimental scale, right? So these things are matters that not just pastors and priests are dealing with. A lot of times when people experience those things, they come to counselors, actually. And the reason is that they're scared to talk about these with their religious communities for fear that they will be ostracized, judged, as not faithful, right? So they're actually more likely to come to a counselor for that reason than they will be to go to their spiritual religious resources like clergy, right? So in other words, this is why people are talking now about we actually might be engaging in malpractice if we shut these conversations down with clients. Why? Because we have so much information now about how spirituality and religiosity are helpful for people, and we're also aware of how it can harm people. And those are two sides of malpractice: withholding something that could be beneficial or discouraging something that could help someone. Does that make sense? Okay, so I put all that up there just to say we're in a much different space to be talking about spiritual bypass than when we started with people like Freud, right? Part of what spiritual bypass is that it's profoundly alluring. It draws people in, and for good reason. And it's because it's connected to these topics of transcendence and meaning and worthiness that we know really connect in very core ways to people's health, right? So I've just put this up to kind of summarize what I've just shared with you. We know these are complicated matters. We know that it appeals to a lot of people. Most people in this country do still belong to a religious tradition. Between 70 and 80% of the US population belongs to a religious tradition. However, the population that's least likely to be a part of a religious tradition, do you know who it is? What's that? Yes, it's young people. So it's just the reverse. So it's only about 30 to 40% of young people through early adulthood are part of a religious tradition. This group is also the ones that are most likely to suffer from the diseases of despair as well, actually. And so people who specialize in child, adolescent, young adult psychology are starting to ring the alarm bells on this because there's a crisis of meaning, there's a crisis of worthiness, there's a crisis of finitude within the younger population that we're not talking about. So this is the first time in our country's history that the U.S. Surgeon General has said the most important health crisis in our country is what? Loneliness. So these diseases of despair are very important to factor in as we're talking about this topic. This is really powerful stuff, and it's powerful for very good psychological reasons. Gordon Allport, who I shared, is one of those voices who had a very different perspective from Freud on this. He said, spirituality is the portion of personality that arises at the core of life and is directed toward the infinite. It's the region of mental life that has the longest range intentions, and for this reason is capable of conferring marked integration upon personality, engendering meaning and peace in the face of tragedy and confusion in life. So part of what has sticking power to spiritual experience is that it is in part about what's happening now, but it relates to the future. So one exercise that I like to do with my students, and many of them I would say are probably not religious and probably would also say they're not very spiritual either, is that I ask them to think about this, and you can do it now while we're talking. What are you going to be doing 5 minutes from now? Think about it. Mentalize it. Imagine it. Right? Now think about what will you be doing 1 hour from now? Can you think about it? Can you envision it? Now extend that out farther. Okay, what will you be doing this weekend? You see what you're doing? Okay. Go farther. Go 1 year from now. What will you be doing? How many of you were asked, did you have a 5-year plan? You know, what were you going to do when you grew up, right? Now keep going farther. And I always like to end with, now what will you be doing after you die? Human beings have this amazing capacity for spiritual awareness, in other words. We have this capacity to imagine what our future will look like. For some of us, and this really is the thing that determines, I think, atheism from religious affiliation, some of us say, at that point, it's it. I stop doing anything. For those of us on the spiritual end of the spectrum, we go, my life continues on. You know, like in the burial mass, you know, you say, life has not ended, it has taken a different form. That's powerful stuff. And, you know, if you have a spiritual experience, it draws you in, it lures you into that space. And these become, for many people, the foundational moments that they anchor their life to. You know, they look back at that experience, and then they look forward to the culmination of that experience. So this is powerful, powerful stuff. And psychologically, it makes sense why we're so drawn to it. There's a lot of different ways to understand what I'm going to share today. And for some people, they're more on the rejectionist end of the spectrum. You know, that spirituality is irrational. There are also people on the more religious end of the spectrum who also say the psychological stuff, that's also psychobabble, right? The Bob Gans, if you remember the Bob Gans. You know, psychological findings, they're not helpful. They're based off pseudoscience, right? I put myself more on the pluralist end of the spectrum, that there are multiple ways of knowing. There are multiple ways of getting at truth. They can come from psychological sources. They can come from sacred sources. Everybody in this room kind of falls on that spectrum. And spiritual bypass is one of those ways, actually, I find really illuminates the way that people tend to view psychological and spiritual topics. The previous voices I shared, you know, those are more of those rejectionist voices. You know, the spiritual experiences, they're just bypassing things, right? But I think a much more helpful way is to look at it more pluralistically. That we need multiple ways of knowing, and each one has its validity to it. Okay. Another way of looking at this is through what are called psychospiritual themes. So psychospiritual themes are ways in which we make sense of psychological material and spiritual material. They're bridging concepts. So every religious and spiritual tradition has a way of making sense of negative emotions. Every spiritual religious tradition has a way of making sense of things like addiction. And our psychological theories have also developed a lot over the last several decades to help us understand better. You know, when you're depressed, there's a lot of significant brain activity that's going on that's going to negatively impact your memory, recall, your psychological perspective, and all that's connected neurologically for us. So we've learned a lot over the last 20, 30 years about how our brain functions with psychological things. But we also have thousands of years of wisdom tradition that is also a part of this conversation. And that part of that conversation has always centered back to these four major areas. Who am I? Who am I, the self? Why am I in pain? What needs to change? And then lastly, what does a flourishing full life look like? And if you think back to your own resources, your own training and education, your own spiritual formation, you have ready answers probably for each one of these. Who am I? How does change look? Psychologically, too, in your training and your practice as a mental health professional, you also have different theories and ways of working with people to help address these issues as well, right? So we need to be aware of how we bring our own training, our own perspective, particularly to this conversation as well. Because the ways in which spiritual bypass can manifest there's a lot of different ways. This is not a complete list. This is just one that my colleagues and I have kind of developed over time, interviewing people, talking with people, working with people. These are some common ways that spiritual bypass has tended to show up and manifest. for some people, there's an irrational commitment or a blind faith to a spiritual teacher or a guru that defers all responsibility onto that teacher, leader, to be the end-all, be-all for their development, who they are, their spiritual life. There can also be ways that this manifests, like attempting to control or contain all of life's challenges through spiritual practice. That's really how John Wellwood started to notice it, was that instead of talking with someone about what they're seeing in their mind, they would avoid talking about it and practice meditation and practice meditation, practice meditation. This can show up in terms of like religious spiritual addiction, like scrupulosity, going over and over and over to confession about the same thing over and over and over again. And this can combine with spiritual leadership in some toxic ways. So if the spiritual leader is not aware of the underlying psychological dynamics that might be going on, like maybe it's obsessive compulsive disorder that's manifesting as spiritual concerns, the spiritual teacher can actually reinforce the bypass process, that this is the only thing that matters, right? And don't go and talk to a counselor about it. So we've seen how this can actually combine in certain ways to reinforce bypass for people. I remember one person in particular who was a child survivor of alcoholism in their home, and they were going through the process of recovery from their addiction and trying to also recover from the trauma that they had grown up with. And they were also a very religious person. And they talked to me one day about how they were really struggling with forgiving their parents. And they felt like they shouldn't be feeling these feelings, that the anger that had turned into bitterness is something that was wrong, that they shouldn't be feeling that. And so when they brought this back to their religious community, folks in their religious group said, well, you would feel better if you forgave your parents. You would feel peace. And judging by the looks on some of your faces, you probably understand a little bit about how that affected that person. That, anger is not something that's a holy feeling to feel. That's something that is spiritually immature, in other words, to feel. That's, I think, how bypass interacts for people, is that there are some, depending upon your perspective, theologically, there can be some truth in that, forgiveness brings peace. And there's good psychological research that says the very same thing, right? But it's more how it's being appropriated in practice in the context of that person's life story that makes it problematic. Because instead of being able to be able to share where they're at, they now feel like they shouldn't be feeling those feelings. And so they need to repress those feelings, which is what you see as alexithymia. So this interacts in very complicated ways for people. But there's this common message that spirituality is the important thing. Your psychological experience is not as important. So what you need to do to get healthy is practice that spirituality more. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a really extraordinary example of how this happened. So what you see in front of you is Dale and Leilani Newman. And Dale Newman was actually studying he was being mentored to become a Pentecostal minister. And through his ordination process, he actually left his church and decided to found his own Pentecostal church. That's really important to mention early in the story, because spiritual bypass is not about one particular religion. It's not about one particular spirituality, theology. It's more about how a person practices and appropriates whatever their theological or spiritual teaching is. So Dale started his own church before being ordained, and in the midst of that, what happened is that their daughter, who was 11 years old at that time, had been manifesting what now we know were symptoms of diabetes. Untreated diabetes, undiagnosed diabetes. And when those symptoms were manifesting, Dale decided that the solution to that was that they were going to hold multiple faith healing meetings to pray for her symptoms to go away. Tragically, after multiple prayer meetings, she started to be in really, really bad shape. And it was one of the folks who had left the church with him that said, I can't do this anymore, and actually called the hospital and the ambulance. She did pass away, unfortunately. And this is the first case in Wisconsin where a faith healing episode was actually ultimately manifested in a charge of homicide. Of second-degree homicide. I think that this is really telling, though, about how Newman understood his spiritual practice. During the court proceedings, he said, if I go to the doctor, I am putting the doctor before God. I am not believing what he said he would do. And if you hear in his phrase there, stacking God or spirituality over and above his daughter's diagnosis with diabetes, I think you have a picture of what I'm talking about when we come to bypass. This is a very extraordinary example about how this can manifest. However, frequently when I talk to people about this, there will oftentimes be one or two people who will come up to me after and will say, my family member was going through cancer, and instead of going to a doctor, they would put prayers all over their room and focus on those prayers and didn't go and get the help that they needed, and also passed away. That's not how it is for everybody, but I do think that's how it is for some people. And then there's a spectrum of where people do fall along that range. Like I said, this is not part of one particular tradition. This is the Zen teacher, Jules Harris. He said, the effects of meditation become transient, but instead of developing deeper insight to the nature of attachment and the ego, novices move on or they move out. This is exactly what John Wellwood was talking about. These are a couple ways that spirituality manifests absence of bypass. I think helps to kind of contrast what they're talking about. Leonard Cohen in the song called Anthem, there's a crack in everything. That's where the light comes in. Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. It's a bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. So therefore, trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and in tranquility. So spiritual traditions also have a way of viewing tragedy, difficulty, disease that isn't simply bypassing. There's a great quote, a couple of quotes from Richard Rohr that I think goes directly into this issue. And he says, contemplation shouldn't be used to spiritually bypass what is real, harmful, or unjust in our lives or the world around us. We cannot jump over this world or its woundedness and still try to love God. We must love God through, in, with, and even because of this world. He goes on to say, all great spirituality is about what we do with our pain. In this time of suffering, we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with our pain? Are we going to blame others for it? Are we going to try to fix it? No one lives on this earth without it. It is the great teacher. Although none of us want to admit it, if we do not transform our pain, we will transmit it in some form. So he's speaking particularly from within Christianity. And if you think of the sacred story of Christ's life, there was a moment in the illumination of Christ's divinity that was incredibly powerful for his disciples. And what do his disciples do when they experience the transfiguration? You remember? Say, let's build a temple and let's stay here. That's another way of saying that, right? Let's stay in this place of spiritual experience. And Jesus' response, I think, is very, very poignant. He says, don't do that. Let's go back down the mountain. So in other words, this was a great thing. This was a great spiritual experience. And we need to journey down. And ultimately, his direction was towards suffering, the cross. But if you continue the story, right, what happens is in his resurrection. His resurrection, are his wounds disappeared? Are they no longer apparent? No, in his transformed body, the wounds are still present. I think it's a beautiful picture of the journey through spiritual conversion, through pain, through suffering, through transformation. Rather than going over suffering, bypassing suffering to transformation. Richard Rohr has a great phrase. He says, we need to include and transcend as opposed to exclude and transcend. That transcendence actually only happens when you include all of life. When you reject part of life, whether that's part of ourselves or others, we actually don't transcend. That I think is spirituality without bypassing. Does that make sense? You see the contrast between those? Okay. All right, so I've shared a lot. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay. 1 minute? 3 minutes. Okay, great. So why don't you turn to a neighbor, just buzz back and forth for maybe a minute, and then we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions after that, okay? So anything that caught your attention, questions about, curious, talk about with a partner for about 1 minute, and then we'll hear your questions. All right. So we have 1 minute or 2 for a question. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's a great question. I will say I'm currently working through that myself. The biggest fear I have is that folks really are unmoored. So any anchoring to any transcendent dimension to life, without that anchoring, I do feel like many people feel adrift. And so what are you left with? You're left with the here and now. You know, what can I consume in the here and now? How can I survive the here and now? And so the orientation shifts to a very brittle version of meaning that if you don't get what you want when you want it, you don't always need it, but when you want it, you're in a crisis. And that's, I think, the real downside to what's happened, is that things become very materialistic, and then it's about what I can get and consume in the here and now. That's not the only way that you can look at meaning and yet still not be religious. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to help people think about shifting their orientation from what can I get to what can I give to you. It's still not necessarily spiritual, right? But it's how can I shift from seeing meaning as what I can get now to what can I do for those other people? What can I give to other people? That's worthiness. It's moving outward, not necessarily toward the infinite, like I'm talking about, but it is a step in the direction of seeing meaning not just in that brittle version, and we all start there, right? But how can I move that meaning toward at least some form of humanistic understanding? That to me, I think, is vital. And I think that's something most people can accept as psychologically beneficial. Does that make sense? So it's not giving them a religion, but it is shaping meaning. Right. What's that? People valuing living in community. Yes. That's right. Yeah. And I think a lot of young people, too, are hoping that you take their concerns seriously. What I've really seen is a shift from other worldly spirituality to like nature spirituality, eco-spirituality, climate change. These are things that younger people are very, very concerned about. And I don't think they think adults are taking it seriously enough, right? Because it's their generation that's going to really be impacted the most of the living generation, right? And so I think taking seriously their concerns without saying it's all about that place over yonder, right? Because they've walled off that explanation. They say you're bypassing the crisis. Does that make sense? Okay.